Timing is everything. To be successful, you need to get started before the legislative session begins on the second Monday of every January.
We get a lot of kind of form emails, and most people communicate by email to their legislators. And those forms that you just kind of like sign your name and then it generates this email that we get hundreds and hundreds of. That is probably the least effective way to communicate. And again, that face-to-face interaction is probably the most effective. But start that process early on. Go talk to the people that are campaigning for office before they even get elected to find out how they're going to vote on your issues that you care about or what they're going to do about them. And start that relationship early so that when you go to their office to have that face-to-face meeting, they're going to know who you are and know what your issue is. You're starting that relationship early, and that's really the way that people can be most effective with the legislature.
Learning about new issues is something we're constantly doing. We have stacks of information being mailed to us from various interest groups out there saying, hey, here's a problem we're seeing, whether it's in your state or other states, and here are some potential solutions. Or constituents calling us up and saying, hey, here's what I'm dealing with, whether it be a business regulation or navigating some complexity in government. And so there are a lot of different ways that information comes at us. And honestly, we're not usually hurting for information. We usually get more than we need. And that's really our function. Our function here is to be able to focus on all the different sides of the different issues and make the best decision we can. Everyone else out there, working and raising their family and going about their day-to-day lives, they're trusting us to make those decisions. And sometimes trust can be a challenge in a political climate like we have, but there's no lack of information coming at us as legislators.
And another thing, there can be a lot of closed-door meetings. The real-life process in Arizona can lack transparency.
The political process is not as neat and clean and as tidy as we think it is when we read it in a textbook. I'm a government teacher. Every year I teach about how bills are made, and it's a very step-by-step process. But what you notice when you go to the legislative system is that it's not nearly as neat and tidy as that is, because there have to be all sorts of conversations that take place in order to get members from one party to maybe vote on the budget that the other party wants to put in place. There are lots of conversations that happen, and sometimes budgets are passed late in the evening. Those final decisions aren't made always right out in front of everybody. A lot of those decisions are made in committees, and then those committees send those budgets or those needs to the full House or the full Senate. And some of those decisions are already made before they come to the full bodies. One of the lessons I've learned is you can't just sit in the main legislative body. You really have to pay attention to what's going on in all the committees. You have to pay attention to where all these different House members and Senate members are at and what their viewpoints are, because all of those play into what the final outcome of a bill is, or the final outcome of a budget and the direction of the House and Senate and what they put forward for the governor to sign really comes down to all these little pieces coming together. And it's not always as neat and tidy as we think it is. And so we just have to pay attention. It's more than just going, and I think that we oftentimes leave state politics aside, or what happens in the state legislature aside. We think that the national government is more important, but really most of our lives, what we do every day is impacted by what happens at the state legislative body and at the state capitol. And so we have to pay attention to all those little things in order to understand what those final outcomes are going to be here.
Probably the most important thing for successfully navigating the informal process is your relationships. Whether you agree with people or not on every issue, getting to know folks who have different views than you do, different opinions than you do, and appreciating their perspective, even if you disagree with it, is critical. Not only for maintaining civility, but just frankly for reaching compromise and agreement. So the number one thing you can do is to make sure that you don't let differences of opinion or even different values be a barrier in having relationships with those on the other side.
Third, the textbook process does not account for how citizen and interest group involvement can dramatically alter a situation.
Interest groups play a critical role in the legislative process by educating and informing members about legislation that they'll be voting on. It's important to remember that these lawmakers are voting on literally dozens and sometimes hundreds of bills each week, and they don't have the time or the capacity to become experts in all of the policy areas that these bills deal with. It's incumbent upon interest groups to be represented at the Capitol, typically by lobbyists, to help these members understand these issues and to educate them and inform them so that they have a better comprehension of the issues that they'll be voting on. Although interest groups and lobbyists are often maligned and denigrated for their work, and there's definitely a stereotypical preconception of what a lobbyist is and what an interest group does, the reality is that lobbyists and the interest groups they represent play a critical role. And I think it's important to note also that lobbyists are not just a corporate phenomenon. The teachers' union or unions have lobbyists. School boards have lobbyists. School district business officials have lobbyists. Environmental groups have lobbyists. They span the political spectrum and span different ideologies. Virtually all interest groups are represented at the Capitol, and they play an important role that most members are very appreciative and grateful for.
Some of it is very obvious. When you have, for instance, 50,000 people marching on the Capitol, that's a real easy one. But beyond that, it's really just a case-by-case situation. So when your committees are meeting and people are coming down to those committees and testifying in committees, we get lots of familiar faces, certain lobbyists or groups that come down, and we see them all the time. But when you start to see sort of the average person who doesn't normally participate coming down and involving themselves in the process and making their ideas and their thoughts and their voice heard, that really does make a difference. And we will start to perk up a little bit more because it's so unusual. And we assume that they represent a number of people out there in the general public that feel that way.
If I were to give folks some tips on navigating the informal process of how bills are passed and how legislation happens, really you just want to be involved. You want to be able to be at the Capitol, come down, find out what's going on in those different legislative hearings, and you want to be able to sit down in those committee hearings and find out who's opposing a bill, who's supporting a bill, because you can really see more of the debates happen in those bodies than they do in larger full chamber debates. And so I would say that that's really important, and really it's important to be plugged in. There's a lot of reporters who report on what happens at the Capitol, and it's really important for voters, and it's really important for people who want to have an impact on what goes on in Arizona at the legislature and at the Capitol, that they read, that they find out what's happening, that they read those news articles, follow some of those reporters on Twitter, follow them on social media, find out what they're doing and what they've learned about the process so that you can be an informed voter, so that you can be an informed person, so that you can have an impact on what happens here at the Capitol.
Fourth, you really do need to have the support of leadership. They need to view a proposed bill as aligned with their vision or agenda for the state. Party leaders work very closely with committee chairs, so it's a good idea to get the support and buy-in from the majority leaders and committee.
So one of the most important aspects of my role as a party leader here at the House, as Speaker of the House, is just keeping everything going. There are so many opportunities in the process as people get worked up about issues where we can get bogged down and you make no progress whatsoever. So just keeping the wheels turning, keeping the process moving is probably one of the most fundamental things that I do as Speaker of the House. And it may not be something that people in the general public are even aware, because usually they see me doing an interview on a particular issue and don't realize all that goes on in the legislative process that frankly is pretty mundane or much more behind the scenes and has nothing to do with policy and really is not controversial at all. But managing the staff, managing the process, that is something that a lot of people don't really see, and it's probably one of the most important things that I do as Speaker of the House.
So having citizens and people of any community participate in the legislative process is hugely important. One of the things that happens is a lot of times the citizens will find problems or challenges, something that affects them personally because of a law that's been passed or not, and they're not really aware of the entire process intimately. And so as party leaders, whether they're Democrat party leaders, Libertarians, Green Party, Democrats, you name it, any Republicans, any particular group, ultimately what you want them to do is to engage the voters in the process, and not just how to vote and to participate, but as citizens of a community, to engage in the process of legislation, because ultimately what you find out is that the legislative process will impact people intimately, but they don't know. A lot of times they don't know what's happening with the bill. They hear about it, sounds good, but they don't understand really what's happening to them until it passes and get there. So we want to engage people. So legislative bodies as well as parties should have a responsibility to reach out to the people and help them become aware of the entire legislative process, especially leading up to laws that are going to govern their behavior.
Fifth, a bill can be resurrected or brought to life at surprising points in the process. One favorite method is the strike all amendment, where a bill is stripped of everything but its number and replaced with entirely different text. If such an amendment is passed on the floor, the bill essentially bypasses the entire process, whether it is a new bill or a dead one brought back to life.